Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we're going to travel far back in time to a world without central heating, without electric lights, without supermarkets, without warm jackets, and without the simple comfort of turning a small dial and making an entire room warm. Imagine waking up before sunrise. The room is dark. The windows are covered with a thin layer of frost. The wooden walls are cold. Your blanket is heavy, but it isn't really warm. Somewhere beneath the ashes of last night's fire, there may still be a tiny glowing ember, and that ember could be one of the most valuable things inside your home. Because for a poor family living in medieval Europe, winter wasn't simply a season. It was a test of food, a test of fuel, a test of clothing, a test of preparation, and sometimes a test of whether a family had managed to save enough before the cold arrived. There was no supermarket to visit when the grain ran out. There was no delivery service when the roads disappeared beneath snow. There was no thermostat to turn upward when the room became uncomfortable. And there certainly wasn't a warm bed waiting for you at the end of a difficult day. For many ordinary people, surviving winter meant using almost everything they had. A little grain, a little firewood, a few onions, some dried peas, a handful of salted food, an old blanket, a thick cloak, and the warmth of another human being sleeping beside them. Tonight, we're going to follow one poor medieval family through an entire winter. We'll see where they lived, what they ate, how they heated their home, how they slept, how they worked, how they protected their children, and what happened when the winter lasted longer than expected. But this isn't going to be a story about kings sitting comfortably inside enormous castles. This is about the people who rarely appeared in medieval paintings. The farmers, the labourers, the servants, the widows, the craftsmen, the village families, the people who built the roads, grew the grain, carried the wood, repaired the roofs, and somehow made it through another cold season. So, get comfortable. Let the lights around you become a little softer. Take a slow breath, and imagine that outside your window, the modern world has disappeared. There are no cars, no traffic, no electric lights, only darkness, wind, and the distant sound of a village settling into a cold medieval night. Our story begins just before winter arrives. Winter did not really begin when the first snow fell. For a medieval family, winter began months earlier. It began during summer. It began when the fields were still green, when the sun was high, when farmers were working from morning until evening, when the harvest was still a promise rather than a memory. A poor family understood something very important. Winter would consume what summer produced. The family might spend months growing grain, vegetables, beans, and other crops. But most of what they produced would not become comfortable meals. A significant portion had to be saved for later. Some grain would become seed for the next planting season. Some would be owed as rent or taxes. Some might go to a lord, landowner, church institution, or other authority, and the remainder would have to feed the household. This meant that harvest time was not simply a happy celebration. It was also a race against time. Grain had to be collected. Hay had to be stored. Vegetables had to be preserved. Animals had to be prepared. Fuel had to be gathered. Roofs had to be checked. Walls had to be repaired. And every small mistake could become much larger once winter arrived. A broken roof in summer was an inconvenience. A broken roof during a winter storm was a serious problem. A shortage of food in August could perhaps be solved. A shortage of food in February was much harder. So, as autumn approached, a poor household would begin counting. How much grain do we have? How much firewood? How much dried food? How many animals? How much salt? How long can these supplies last? There was no spreadsheet, no calculator, no neat inventory list hanging on the wall. Instead, people relied on memory, experience, and simple physical containers. A sack of grain, a wooden chest, a clay pot, a barrel, a bundle of dried herbs, a string of onions, a pile of firewood. These ordinary objects represented something much more important: time. Every sack of grain represented another number of meals. Every bundle of wood represented another cold evening that could be made slightly warmer. Every preserved vegetable represented another day when the family didn't have to depend entirely on grain. Winter was coming, and the household had to be ready. Now imagine the house itself. A poor medieval home was usually nothing like the stone castles we see in movies. Many ordinary rural homes were relatively small. Depending on the region and period, houses could be built from timber, earth, wattle and daub, stone, or combinations of different materials. The walls were designed primarily to provide shelter, not luxury, not perfect insulation, just protection from the outside world. A house might contain one main living space. Sometimes there were additional areas for storage or sleeping. The floor could be packed earth. In some homes, rushes, straw, or other materials were spread across the floor. The roof might be thatched, and the windows were often small. That mattered. Small openings meant less wind entering the house, but they also meant less light. During winter, the interior could become remarkably dark. Imagine living in a home where the brightest thing you see after sunset is a small fire. The fire is not only a source of heat, it is the kitchen, the lamp, the gathering place, the place where people repair tools, the place where food is cooked, the place where stories are told, and sometimes the place where animals are kept nearby. The exact arrangement varied enormously across medieval Europe. There was no single medieval house. A poor household in England would not necessarily live like a poor household in northern France. A family in Scandinavia faced different conditions from one in southern Europe. Climate, local building traditions, available materials, wealth, and time period all mattered. But one thing remained true. Heat was precious. A modern home can lose heat and simply create more. A medieval home could not. If the fire went out, someone had to restart it. If there was no dry fuel, restarting it became harder. And if there wasn't enough fuel, the family simply had to endure the cold. For a poor medieval family, the fire was almost like another member of the household. Everyone depended on it. The fire cooked food. It heated water. It provided light. It helped dry clothing. It made the room more comfortable. And it allowed people to gather together. But fire also required fuel. And fuel had to come from somewhere. Wood was extremely important in many regions. Families might collect fallen branches, gather brushwood, use wood from permitted areas, or obtain fuel through local arrangements. Wealthier households could have better access to firewood. Poor households had to be much more careful. They could not simply burn wood without thinking about tomorrow. Tonight's warm fire could become tomorrow's empty woodpile. So the fire was often kept relatively small. A small fire could cook a pot. It could provide enough warmth for people sitting nearby, but it could not necessarily heat every corner of a house. This created an interesting pattern. People gathered around the heat. They didn't expect the entire room to be warm. Instead, they moved closer to the source of warmth. Children sat near adults. People worked beside the fire. Cooking was carefully organized. And when night arrived, the family tried to make the most of whatever heat remained. The goal was not comfort in the modern sense. The goal was endurance. If the fire burned too strongly, fuel disappeared quickly. If it burned too weakly, everyone became uncomfortable. So someone had to keep watching it. Someone had to add fuel. Someone had to preserve the embers. And that meant that even sleep could be connected to the fire. Before going to bed, a household might carefully manage the hearth so that useful embers remained. Because tomorrow morning, those embers could save time and fuel. A single glowing piece of charcoal could become the beginning of another fire. And another fire meant another day of cooking, another day of light, another night of warmth. Now comes one of the most important questions. What did a poor family eat during winter? The answer was usually not a feast, it was repetition. Simple food. Food that could be stored, food that could be stretched. Grain was enormously important. Bread, porridge, gruel, and other grain-based foods could provide calories and fill hungry stomachs. But bread was not always the same. The quality depended on the grain available and the wealth of the household. Poorer families could consume darker, coarser breads. Different grains were used in different places. Wheat was highly valued, but barley, rye, oats, millet, and other grains could also play important roles depending on the region. Then there were legumes, peas, beans, lentils in some regions. These could provide an important addition to a grain-heavy diet. Vegetables were also valuable, but fresh vegetables were difficult to keep throughout a long winter, so preservation became essential. Root vegetables could be stored. Onions could be kept. Cabbage could be preserved. Dried peas could sit for long periods. Food preservation was one of the quiet technologies of survival. No refrigerator was necessary if you understood how to dry, salt, ferment, smoke, or otherwise preserve food. Meat was different. For poor families, meat consumption varied greatly by region, season, religious practice, occupation, and economic status. A family might keep animals not because they intended to eat them immediately, but because animals represented future resources. A chicken could provide eggs. A goat could provide milk. A pig could eventually provide meat and fat. But animals also required food. During winter, that created another problem. You had to feed the animals while feeding yourself. Every household had to make decisions. What can we afford to keep? What can we preserve? What must we consume now? What must survive until spring? Winter turned food into mathematics. Autumn was a strange season. It was beautiful, but it could also be frightening. The fields changed color. The days became shorter. The air became colder. And every week brought the family closer to the period when nothing new would grow. The harvest was therefore one of the most important moments of the year. Imagine carrying bundles of grain into storage. Your hands are tired. Your back hurts. The daylight is disappearing. But you keep working. Because rain could destroy what remained in the fields. A storm could flatten crops. Dampness could damage stored grain. And once the harvest was finished, The family still had work to do. Storage areas needed protection from moisture and pests. Food needed to be organized. Some crops had to be processed. Some needed to be dried. Some needed to be placed underground or in appropriate storage spaces. The household had to make its supplies last. A poor family couldn't afford to waste much. A handful of grain spilled on the floor might seem insignificant, but when supplies were limited, every small loss mattered. The family might also prepare clothing. Winter clothing wasn't necessarily bought from a modern store. People repaired what they already owned. Old clothing could be patched. Fabric could be reused. Wool could be particularly valuable in colder regions. A garment might have several lives. First as a good piece of clothing, then as a patched garment, then perhaps as something used around the house, then finally as a piece of material for another purpose. Nothing was casually thrown away. A medieval family could not make the entire house warm, so they focused on keeping the cold out. This meant closing openings, repairing walls, maintaining roofs, blocking drafts where possible, hanging cloth or other materials across openings. The smallest gap could become noticeable on a windy night. Imagine sitting beside a wall and feeling a cold stream of air moving through the room. You can't simply increase the thermostat. You have to find the gap. Maybe the wind is coming beneath a door. Maybe through a poorly sealed window. Maybe through the roof. Maybe between pieces of wall material. Every draft was a reminder that the house was not perfectly sealed. People also used their own bodies as sources of warmth. This sounds obvious, but it mattered. Families slept close together. People shared sleeping spaces. Children might sleep near parents or siblings. Beds could be simple structures. Mattresses might contain straw or other available materials. Blankets and coverings were valuable. The bed wasn't necessarily a luxurious private space. It was a practical place for the household to survive the night. And nighttime could be the hardest part. During the day, people moved. They worked. They cooked. They carried things. They gathered fuel. Movement generated warmth. At night, movement stopped. The fire might become smaller. The temperature dropped. And the family had to depend on bedding, clothing, shelter, and body heat. Perhaps the greatest winter resource was something surprisingly simple: wood. Without enough fuel, everything became harder. Cooking became harder. Heating became harder. Lighting became harder. And even drying wet clothing became harder. But poor families couldn't always collect unlimited firewood. Forests were not simply open spaces where anyone could take whatever they wanted. Access to woodland could be controlled by local customs, landowners, or legal rights. A family might have certain rights to collect specific types of fuel. In other situations, people could gather fallen branches or other materials where permitted. The details varied greatly, but the basic problem remained. Fuel had to be acquired. That meant work. A person had to walk out into the cold, find suitable material, carry it home, dry it, store it, and repeat the process. Imagine doing that without a modern vehicle. A bundle of wood might be heavy. The path might be muddy. The snow might be deep. And the daylight might be short. This was one reason preparation mattered so much. A family that entered winter with a good fuel supply had a significant advantage. A family that entered winter with very little fuel was vulnerable. And when the weather became unusually cold, even a carefully prepared household could struggle. Winter did not mean vacation. Poor people still had to work. The type of work changed. Farmers had fewer field tasks, but there was still plenty to do. Tools needed repair. Buildings needed maintenance. Wood needed cutting. Animals needed feeding. Clothing needed mending. Food needed preparation. People might engage in crafts or seasonal labor. Some work could be done indoors: spinning, weaving, repairing, carving, preparing equipment for spring. The household economy continued. For many families, winter was actually a period when careful management became more important. Every day required decisions. How much fuel can we burn? How much food can we cook? Can we afford to use this piece of cloth? Should we repair this tool or make another? Can we spare food for this animal? Could someone earn a little money through work? These questions didn't disappear simply because the fields were covered in frost. In fact, winter could make poverty more visible. A wealthy household might have stored food, servants, larger buildings, better clothing, and more fuel. A poor household had fewer options. The difference between rich and poor became especially obvious when nature became difficult. Modern winter clothing is remarkably effective. A medieval poor family had nothing like a modern insulated jacket. Instead, warmth came from layers. Wool could be extremely useful. It could retain warmth even when somewhat damp, making it valuable in colder climates. But wool clothing required resources. Someone had to raise sheep, shear them, process the wool, spin fibers, create yarn, weave or otherwise construct fabric, then make clothing. This was labor-intensive. Clothing therefore had value. A person might wear the same garment for years. It could be repaired again and again. Holes were patched. Tears were sown. Edges were reinforced. Children grew, and clothing might be altered or passed down. A poor family's wardrobe was not a collection of seasonal fashion. It was equipment. Every garment had a purpose. A cloak could protect against wind. A hood could protect the head. Gloves or mittens could protect hands. Leg coverings could reduce exposure to cold. Footwear was especially important. Cold, wet feet could make outdoor work miserable, and medieval roads could become muddy, icy, or snowy. So keeping clothing dry was almost as important as having warm clothing. At the end of a long day, wet garments needed to be dried carefully, but drying them required heat, and heat required fuel. Once again, winter became a chain of problems connected to one another. Now imagine midnight. The fire has become quiet. The house is dark. The family has gone to sleep. There is no electric heater, no heated mattress, no warm bathroom waiting in the morning. The room is cold, very cold. The bed is where the family concentrates whatever warmth they can preserve. Bedding materials varied. Straw was commonly used in some contexts. Other materials could also be used depending on region and wealth. Beds themselves could range from very simple sleeping arrangements to more elaborate structures. But for poor households, practicality mattered. The family needed something that could be repaired, something that could be replaced, something made from available materials. People slept close together. Children might share space. The entire family adapted to the limited warmth available. And when morning arrived, getting out of bed was not necessarily pleasant. The room was still cold. The fire needed attention. Someone had to get up. Someone had to restart the day's activity. The temptation to remain under the blankets must have been strong. But hunger and work were stronger. A medieval winter morning began not with an alarm clock, but with responsibility. Outside the house, the entire village changed. Summer had been noisy. People worked in fields. Animals moved around. Carts traveled along roads. Neighbors interacted. Winter slowed everything down. Snow could make roads difficult. Mud could become a constant problem. Shorter days reduced working hours. The village might appear strangely quiet. Smoke rose from chimneys and openings. Dogs moved between houses. Animals were brought closer to shelter. People carried wood. Children stayed indoors more often. And travelers became less common. But the village did not completely stop. There were still markets in places where conditions allowed, still craftsmen, still religious activities, still local gatherings, still work. The rhythm simply changed. Winter was a season of endurance, and everyone understood that spring was coming. The question was whether their supplies would last until then. The most frightening moment of winter wasn't always the coldest day. Sometimes it was the day someone looked into the storage area and realized there wasn't as much food left as there should have been. Maybe the harvest had been poor. Maybe grain had spoiled. Maybe an animal had died. Maybe the family had been larger than expected. Maybe food prices had increased. Maybe the winter simply lasted longer. A household could carefully calculate its supplies and still discover that the numbers weren't enough. Then people had to adapt. Meals could become smaller. Ingredients could be stretched. Porridge could become thinner. More vegetables might be added when available. Bread could be made with whatever grain remained. For children, winter could be particularly difficult. Children were smaller. They had less control over their environment, and they depended on adults for food, clothing, shelter, and warmth. But children were also part of the household economy. As they became old enough, they could help with simple tasks, collecting small pieces of fuel, helping care for animals, carrying items, assisting with household work, preparing food, spinning or other crafts in some settings. The exact tasks depended on age, place, and family circumstances. Winter could therefore be both a time of hardship and a time when families stayed closer together. Children learned by watching adults. They learned how to prepare food, how to repair things, how to preserve resources, how to care for animals, how to survive difficult weather. Knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. A parent didn't need to explain every rule. A child could simply watch. And after enough winters, that child would understand. A medieval household did not exist separately from its animals. Animals were part of the survival system. Cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, horses, and other animals depending on the region. But winter created a difficult balance. Animals needed food. Food was limited. Some animals could be fed using stored hay or other materials. Others might forage where conditions allowed. Farmers had to decide which animals were worth keeping. A productive animal could be extremely valuable. A cow could provide milk. Sheep could provide wool. Chickens could provide eggs. A horse could help with transport and agricultural work. But every animal consumed resources. The household had to maintain the balance. Too many animals could consume supplies too quickly. Too few animals could make spring work more difficult. Winter therefore tested not only human survival, but the entire household system. One of the most psychologically difficult parts of winter must have been darkness. Modern people are surrounded by artificial light. Medieval households were not. When daylight disappeared, light became another resource. Candles existed, lamps existed, but fuel and materials were not free. Poor families could not simply illuminate every corner of their homes. A small fire might provide most of the useful light. People therefore adjusted their schedules. Some work was done during daylight. Indoor tasks could continue near the fire. But darkness still had influence over daily life. Imagine a winter evening beginning early. The sun disappears. The outside world becomes black. The house becomes a small island of warmth and light. Beyond the walls is darkness. Inside, people sit together. Someone repairs clothing. Someone prepares food. Someone talks. Someone tells a story. Someone simply listens to the fire. This is perhaps one of the most peaceful images we can imagine from medieval life. Not because the life was easy. It wasn't. But because the human need for companionship is timeless. When the outside world becomes cold and dark, people gather together. Survival was not always an individual activity. Villages depended on relationships. A neighbor might help repair a roof. Someone might lend a tool. Another family might exchange food. A craftsman might repair something in exchange for another service. Communities developed customs and systems of mutual support. These relationships could become extremely important during difficult periods. Imagine a household that suddenly loses part of its roof during a storm. One family alone might struggle to repair it, but several neighbors working together could solve the problem much faster. The same principle applied to many other tasks. People were not completely isolated. The medieval village was a social network long before anyone used that phrase. Of course, relationships could also be complicated. Communities had conflicts. People argued. Resources could create tension. Not everyone received equal help. But cooperation remained an important part of everyday survival. Most winters were not disasters, but occasionally weather became unusually severe. Long periods of cold, heavy snowfall, persistent rain, flooding, failed harvests, animal losses. These could combine into something much worse. A poor family might survive one bad season, but several difficulties occurring together could be devastating. Imagine entering winter with a smaller harvest than expected. Then imagine the winter lasting longer. Then imagine losing an animal. Then imagine food becoming more expensive. The household suddenly has fewer options. This is why medieval people feared food shortages. Agriculture depended heavily on weather, and weather could not be controlled. No matter how carefully a farmer prepared, nature could still change the outcome. This uncertainty shaped medieval life. People hoped for a good harvest. They prepared for winter. And they understood that preparation could reduce risk, but never eliminate it. Let's return inside the house. The kitchen, or cooking area, was one of the busiest parts of the home. A pot could hang over the fire. Inside might be grain, peas, vegetables, herbs, and whatever other ingredients were available. Slow cooking was practical. A large pot could feed several people. It could also transform simple ingredients into something more filling. Bread might be baked when the household had access to an appropriate oven or communal baking arrangement. The exact methods varied from place to place, but cooking had one major goal: make limited food useful. Nothing needed to be fancy. A warm meal could be extremely valuable after a cold day. Imagine returning from outside. Your hands are cold. Your clothes are damp. You smell smoke as you enter. Then you see a pot over the fire. Steam rises. The room is warmer near the hearth. Someone hands you a bowl. The meal is simple. Perhaps grain. Perhaps peas. Perhaps vegetables. Maybe a little meat or fat if the household can afford it. But after hours in the cold, it feels like comfort. When we imagine medieval winter, we often imagine castles. Huge stone walls, massive fireplaces, servants carrying firewood, heavy curtains, warm chambers. But that was not the experience of most people. The majority of medieval Europeans were not wealthy nobles. They were ordinary workers, farmers, tenants, labourers, craftspeople, servants. Their homes were smaller, their supplies were more limited, their clothing was simpler, and their margin for error was much smaller. A wealthy family might survive a bad harvest by purchasing food. A poor family might not have enough money to do that. A wealthy household could buy more fuel. A poor household might have to gather it. A wealthy person could replace damaged clothing. A poor person repaired it. This doesn't mean every poor person was constantly freezing or starving. That would be an oversimplification. People developed practical methods for dealing with their environment. They built homes suited to local climates. They preserved food. They stored fuel. They shared resources. They adapted. But life remained physically demanding, and winter made that reality impossible to ignore. Let's now follow one ordinary winter day. The sun has not risen yet. The house is dark. A family wakes. The first task is the fire. Someone checks the hearth. If embers remain, they are carefully encouraged. Small fuel is added. Smoke rises. Eventually, a flame appears. The room slowly becomes brighter. Breakfast is simple. Perhaps a warm grain dish. Perhaps bread. Perhaps something left from the previous day. There is no rush toward a modern workplace, but there is still work waiting. Animals need attention. Water needs to be collected. Fuel needs to be carried. Tools need repair. Food needs preparation. Clothing may need mending. The day passes slowly. Outside, the winter landscape is quiet. At midday, the family eats again. The meal is not enormous. It doesn't need to be. The goal is to provide enough energy to continue. Afternoon arrives. The daylight begins to fade. More wood is brought inside. The fire becomes important again. The household gathers. The evening meal is prepared. Afterward, people remain near the fire. Someone works. Someone talks. Someone tells a story. Perhaps there is laughter. Perhaps there is silence. Eventually, the fire is reduced. The family prepares for sleep. And another winter day disappears. Nothing dramatic happened. And that is precisely the point. Survival was often made of ordinary days. One day became another. One meal became another. One fire became another. One cold night became another. Until finally, spring arrived. Winter was not only physical, it could also be mentally exhausting. Imagine constantly knowing that your supplies were limited. You don't know exactly how long the cold will last. You don't know whether your food will be enough. You don't know whether your roof will hold during the next storm. You don't know whether your animals will remain healthy. Modern people can often solve problems quickly by purchasing something. Medieval families often had to solve problems with what they already possessed. That required patience, creativity, experience, and acceptance. You repair instead of replace. You preserve instead of waste. You share instead of buying. You wait instead of ordering. This mindset shaped everyday life. People were used to living within limits, and winter made those limits visible. A medieval winter taught people something that modern life sometimes allows us to forget. Resources have limits. Warmth has limits. Food has limits. Time has limits. And preparation matters. The family that stored grain carefully had more options. The family that repaired the roof had fewer problems. The family that saved fuel had more warmth. The family that preserved food had more meals. The family that maintained relationships had more support. These lessons were not written in textbooks. They were learned through experience. A child who watched a parent carefully save firewood understood something. A person who survived a difficult winter remembered it, and that memory influenced future decisions. The next summer, perhaps they collected more fuel, stored more food, repaired the roof earlier, saved better clothing, because winter always came back. When we study medieval history, we often remember kings, queens, battles, castles, great churches, famous rulers. But beneath all of that was another history, the history of ordinary people, the people who woke before sunrise, the people who carried water, the people who harvested grain, the people who repaired shoes, the people who gathered wood, the people who cooked simple meals, the people who raised children, the people who waited for spring. Their names were often not recorded. We don't know what most of them thought. We don't know their favorite songs. We don't know what jokes they told around the fire. We don't know what they dreamed about. But we do know that they lived. They adapted. They worked. They endured. And generation after generation continued. Their survival created the foundations of later societies. The village is quiet now. Most of the work is finished. The last meal has been eaten. The animals are sheltered. And inside one small house, the family prepares for another long winter night. The fire has become smaller. There are only a few pieces of wood left beside the hearth. Someone carefully moves one piece closer to the embers. A faint orange glow appears. For a moment, the room becomes brighter. Then the flame settles down again. Outside, the wind moves across the fields. The roof makes a soft sound. The walls creak. And somewhere beyond the village, snow continues to fall. For a modern person, this might seem unbearably cold. But the family has learned how to live with it. They know where the warmest part of the room is. They know which blanket belongs to which person. They know how much wood can be burned tonight. They know how much food remains. They know that tomorrow will bring another day of work. And they know that eventually winter will end. This knowledge itself is comforting, because people can become surprisingly good at adapting to the world they are born into. A medieval family didn't compare its home to a modern heated house. They didn't know what central heating felt like. Their idea of comfort was different. A small fire could feel wonderful. A thick cloak could feel luxurious. A warm bowl of porridge could feel like a perfect meal. And a dry room on a snowy night could feel like safety. The family settles down. The youngest children sleep close together. The adults lie nearby. The fire slowly becomes embers. And the medieval night continues. Morning arrives slowly. There is no alarm, no bright electric light, only the gradual change from darkness to grey. Someone wakes first. For a few moments they remain still beneath the blankets. Then comes the realization. The fire. It needs attention. The person gets up. The floor is cold. The air is colder. They move toward the hearth and inspect the ashes. If the embers survived, the morning becomes easier. A few small pieces of dry material are placed carefully over them. The person blows gently. Smoke rises. Then a tiny flame appears. The fire is alive again. Another winter day begins. But today is different. During the night, a storm passed through the village. The family opens the door. Cold air enters immediately. Outside, the landscape has changed. Snow has covered the paths. Branches are bent under its weight. The fields have disappeared beneath white. The road is almost impossible to see. For a moment, everyone simply looks. Then the practical questions begin. Is the roof still safe? Are the animals okay? Can we reach the water source? Do we have enough firewood inside? What about the neighboring family? Winter rarely allowed people to ignore practical problems for long. Someone has to act. And so, even after a storm, the village slowly wakes. Doors open. People step outside. Snow is moved. Animals are checked. Roofs are inspected. And life continues. We often think about food and fire when imagining medieval winter. But water was just as necessary. And getting clean water could become harder in freezing weather. A family still needed water for drinking, cooking, cleaning, animals, and other household needs. There were wells, streams, springs, and other local sources, depending on the settlement. But winter could make access difficult. A path might become slippery. A stream could freeze. A well could become difficult to operate. Snow could cover familiar routes. So someone had to leave the warmth of the house. They carried a container, walked through the cold, collected water, and brought it home. Imagine doing this every day. Not once, not occasionally, every day. The task seems ordinary, but ordinary tasks were often the foundation of medieval survival. A modern person can turn on a tap without thinking. For a medieval family, water was a physical responsibility. Someone had to collect it, someone had to carry it, and someone had to make sure there was enough. This was another reason household work consumed so much time. Survival was built from hundreds of small tasks. None of them seemed extraordinary on their own. Together, they filled the day. Travel during winter could be difficult. Roads were not like modern highways. They could be muddy, uneven, narrow, and poorly maintained. Snow could hide obstacles. Ice could make walking dangerous. A journey that normally took a few hours might take much longer. For poor families, travel could be especially difficult because they had fewer resources. A wealthy traveler might have animals, servants, better clothing, and other support. A poor person might simply walk, carrying whatever was necessary. Winter therefore made the world feel smaller. A nearby village might seem far away. A market might become difficult to reach. A distant relative might be impossible to visit. And messages could take longer to travel. The weather controlled movement. When the roads became difficult, people stayed home. This meant that winter could create a feeling of isolation. The village became a small world. The house became an even smaller world. And the fire became the center of that world. Markets did not simply disappear during winter. Where conditions allowed, people still traded. But winter changed what was available. Fresh produce became limited. Stored foods became more important. Fuel became valuable. Clothing and footwear could be especially useful. People might trade goods, labor, food, animals, tools, or other resources. For a poor family, a market could be an important place. But there was a problem. You needed something to trade. And if you had very little, every transaction mattered. Perhaps someone had eggs. Another person had extra grain. Someone else could repair shoes. Another could provide firewood. The medieval economy was complicated, but much of everyday survival depended on exchanges between people. Money was important in many places, but not every transaction looked like a modern purchase. Labor and goods could move between households in many ways. And during winter, practical needs often became especially obvious. Everyone needed something: food, fuel, clothing, repairs, and sometimes help. Imagine listening to a medieval village at night. There are no engines, no refrigerators humming, no airplanes, no distant traffic. The soundscape is completely different. Perhaps you hear wind, the crackle of a fire, a wooden door moving slightly, an animal making a quiet sound, someone coughing, a child shifting in sleep, rain against the roof, or snow falling silently. The absence of modern noise may have made natural sounds much more noticeable. A storm could sound enormous. Wind against a wooden building could become part of the experience of the night. And inside the home, the smallest sounds mattered. The fire, breathing, movement, whispers, the quiet conversation of family members. Winter nights were long, and when darkness lasted for hours, people had plenty of time to listen. Perhaps someone told a story. Perhaps an old tale was repeated. Perhaps people talked about the coming spring. Perhaps they simply sat in silence. History rarely records these conversations, but they must have happened, because people have always needed stories. The fire was more than heat. It was also a place for memory. Older people could tell younger people stories. Some stories explained local traditions. Some were religious. Some were about ancestors. Some were simply entertaining. A child might hear the same story many times, and every winter it could return. The story itself became part of the season. Imagine a dark room. Outside, the wind is cold. Inside, someone begins speaking. The children listen. The adults already know the ending, but they listen anyway. Because the value of a story isn't always in discovering what happens. Sometimes it's in hearing something familiar. Winter encouraged this kind of repetition. There was less daylight, less outdoor work, more time around the fire, and stories filled that time. In a world without television, smartphones, or streaming services, imagination became entertainment. A voice could create an entire world. A simple fire could become the center of an evening. And a family could travel through stories without ever leaving the house. One of the biggest differences between medieval life and modern life was the relationship with objects. Today, when something breaks, replacing it can sometimes be easier than repairing it. For a poor medieval family, replacement was often impossible, so things were repaired. Again and again. A wooden handle could be fixed. A piece of clothing could be patched. A basket could be repaired. A shoe could be worked on. A tool could be sharpened. A cooking container could sometimes be repaired depending on its material. Nothing was automatically considered disposable. This created a different relationship with possessions. A tool might be used for years. A garment might pass from one person to another. A piece of furniture could remain in a household for generations. Winter was a good reminder of this. When resources were limited, repairing became survival. A broken tool during summer was inconvenient. A broken tool during winter could interfere with essential work. So maintenance mattered. People had to think ahead. Colder parts of Europe, wool could be extremely valuable. Sheep provided more than meat. They provided fiber. That fiber could become yarn. Yarn could become cloth. And cloth could become clothing. The process required considerable labor. Shearing, cleaning, preparing fibers, spinning, weaving, cutting, sewing. By the time a piece of wool clothing reached a household, many hours of work might already have been invested in it. This explains why clothing was treated carefully. A wool garment wasn't simply fabric. It represented labor, time, animals, skill, and resources. A cloak could be repaired many times. A wool blanket could be treasured. A good garment could make the difference between tolerable and miserable outdoor work. For a poor family, clothing was part of their winter equipment. Food kept the body going. Fuel provided warmth. And clothing protected the body from the outside world. Imagine walking across a medieval village in winter. The ground is wet, then frozen, then muddy again. Your shoes are exposed to everything. Cold, water, ice, mud, rough stones. A poor person's footwear had to survive harsh conditions, and replacing footwear wasn't necessarily easy. This made shoe repair extremely important. A damaged shoe could cause serious inconvenience. If your feet became wet and cold, walking and working became harder. And walking was essential. You walked to collect water. You walked to gather fuel. You walked to visit neighbors. You walked to work. You walked to markets. You walked because there were no cars waiting outside. So footwear was practical equipment. A good pair of shoes was valuable. A damaged pair was repaired. And when repair was no longer possible, people had to improvise. Winter reminded everyone how important the ground beneath their feet really was. Let's step into the family storage area. There is no supermarket shelf, no freezer, no refrigerator. Instead, there are containers and carefully preserved supplies. Grain, dried peas, onions, maybe roots, perhaps salted or preserved foods. The exact contents depend on region and wealth. But every item has a purpose. The family doesn't look at the storehouse and think about abundance. They think about duration. How many weeks? How many months? Can this last until spring? A storage room is therefore almost like a calendar. Every time food is removed, the remaining supply becomes smaller. The family knows that. They can see it, feel it, and perhaps worry about it. The goal is to make the storehouse last until new food becomes available. That means resisting waste, using leftovers, combining ingredients, choosing when to eat certain foods, and sometimes accepting that meals will be simpler than usual. For poor families, There could be a narrow line between having enough and falling short. A small problem could push the household toward difficulty. A poor harvest, a sick animal, a damaged roof, a rise in food prices, a family member unable to work, a longer winter. Each problem might be manageable by itself, but several problems together could become serious. This is why medieval poverty cannot be understood simply as having little money. It was also about having little margin. If you have abundant resources, a bad week is a bad week. If you have almost nothing extra, a bad week can affect the entire season. Poor families therefore depended heavily on planning. They saved what they could. They reused what they could. They relied on neighbors. They adapted. And they hoped that the weather would remain reasonable. Winter made the margin smaller. Cold weather could create additional challenges when someone became ill. Medical knowledge in medieval Europe varied enormously by time and place. There were trained medical practitioners in some settings. There were healers. There were herbal traditions. There were religious institutions involved in care. And there were countless household remedies. But ordinary families often had limited options. If someone became sick, the family had to continue working while also caring for that person. That could be difficult. A person who normally collected wood could no longer do the task. A person who cooked might need to rest. A child might require extra attention. This meant that illness could affect the entire household economy. The family had to rearrange responsibilities. Someone else had to work harder. Neighbors might help. Relatives might become involved. The exact experience varied greatly. But one thing is clear. In a household where every person contributed, losing one person's labor could matter. Winter made that especially difficult. Older people had an important place in many households. They might no longer perform the heaviest physical labor, but they possessed something extremely valuable: experience. They had lived through previous winters. They knew which foods lasted. They knew how to repair things. They knew local weather patterns. They remembered difficult years. They could teach children. They could help with household tasks. And around the fire, they could tell stories. A young person might know how to do a task. An older person might know why it should be done that way. This accumulated knowledge could make a real difference. Winter was a season when practical knowledge became visible. How to preserve food, how to keep a fire alive, how to prepare clothing, how to store supplies, how to recognize weather changes. Such knowledge was passed through generations. Medieval Europe was deeply shaped by religion, though practices differed by region and period. The calendar itself was influenced by religious festivals and seasons. Winter included important celebrations and observances. For many communities, religious life provided structure during the darkest months. Churches could become gathering places. People attended services. Festivals provided moments of community. Food might be shared. Families might gather. These occasions could provide psychological relief from the repetitive work of winter. Even when life was difficult, people still marked special days. This is important. Human beings don't stop celebrating simply because circumstances are hard. Sometimes celebration becomes more meaningful because ordinary life is difficult. A warm meal shared with others can feel special. A gathering can break the monotony of winter. A familiar tradition can remind people that the season is temporary. Winter may be cold, but the calendar continues. The middle of winter could feel endless. The excitement of autumn preparation was gone. The promise of spring was still distant. The family had been living on stored food for weeks. The woodpile had become smaller. The days were short, and the cold had become familiar. This was the season when patience mattered. You couldn't simply decide that winter was over. You had to wait. The family continued its routines. Morning, work, meal, repair, fire, evening, sleep, then again, and again. A medieval winter was not necessarily a dramatic series of disasters. Often, it was simply repetition. And that repetition required resilience, the ability to do the same necessary things every day. Even when the weather was unpleasant. Even when the work was tiring. Even when spring seemed far away. By now, the children understood the routine. They knew where the wood was kept. They knew when food was prepared. They knew that certain items were not to be wasted. They knew that wet clothing needed to be dried. They knew that the fire required attention. They knew that winter meant staying close to home. These lessons were practical. No classroom was necessary. The household itself was the school. A child watched, then helped, then learned. Eventually, that child became an adult who knew how to manage a household. The knowledge was almost invisible, but it was essential. Civilization survived not only through great inventions. They survive because ordinary people teach the next generation how to live. And every winter became another lesson. Imagine the smell inside the house. Smoke from the fire. Wood. Cooked grain. Dried herbs. Wool clothing. Damp shoes. Animals nearby. The smell of a lived-in home. Modern houses are often separated into specialized spaces. Kitchen. Bedroom. Living room. Storage room. Laundry room. A medieval poor household could be much less separated. Cooking, sleeping, working, and living could happen close together. That meant smells traveled. Smoke lingered. Food smells filled the room. Wet clothing dried near heat. The home had a distinct atmosphere. For the people living there, these smells were ordinary. For us, they might seem unfamiliar. But smell is one of the strongest connections to memory. A person who lived through many winters might forever associate certain smells with safety. Smoke. Warm food. Wool. Wood. The smell of home. There is something special about firelight. It moves. It changes. It creates shadows. A medieval family would have spent many evenings watching it. The walls might appear to move as flames flickered. Faces became brighter and darker. Tools cast long shadows. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. The fire became the visual center of the room. For children, it might have been fascinating. For adults, it was useful. For everyone, it was comforting. The fire didn't just provide heat. It made the darkness less frightening. Outside was winter. Inside was light. The difference between those two worlds could be felt immediately. And perhaps that is why the hearth became such an important symbol across many cultures. It represented home, food, warmth, family, life. As winter continued, the woodpile became smaller. At first, it had seemed enormous. Now there were gaps. The family noticed. They had to become more careful. Maybe the fire could be smaller during the afternoon. Maybe everyone could gather closer together. Maybe cooking could be planned so that one fire served several purposes. This was efficiency. Burning fuel simply for comfort might not be wise. But burning fuel to cook food and heat water at the same time made sense. Every resource could have multiple uses. This kind of thinking was necessary. Because winter was not just about surviving today's cold. It was about making sure you could survive tomorrow's cold too. Then one morning, something feels different. It is difficult to explain. The air is still cold. The ground may still be frozen. But the light has changed. The day is a little longer. The darkness doesn't arrive quite as early. The family notices. Spring is still far away. But it is coming. The thought changes everything. The remaining food suddenly has a purpose. Just a little longer. The remaining fuel has a purpose. Just a little longer. The remaining strength has a purpose. Just a little longer. This is one of the strange things about difficult seasons. Sometimes hope doesn't require a dramatic change. Sometimes it only requires knowing that the season will end. The family begins preparing. Tools are inspected. Wooden handles are repaired. Metal parts are cleaned and sharpened. Clothing is repaired. Seeds are protected. Animals receive more attention. The household slowly moves from winter survival toward spring preparation. The difference is subtle. But the mindset changes. During winter, the question was, how do we make what we have last? Now the question becomes, what do we need for the next season? This transition was essential. Agricultural societies couldn't simply wait for spring and then begin planning. Preparation had to happen beforehand. The future harvest depended partly on the work done before planting. And so, even before the fields became green, the next year was already beginning. Eventually, signs of life appear. A small plant. A patch of grass. A change in the fields. Birds become more noticeable. Animals behave differently. The world begins to wake. The family sees these changes. The long winter is finally ending. For modern people, spring can simply mean warmer weather. For a medieval agricultural household, spring meant possibility. Possibility of food. Possibility of work. Possibility of rebuilding supplies. Possibility of another harvest. But spring also meant another long cycle of labor. The family couldn't simply relax. The fields needed attention. The animals needed care. The next winter was already waiting somewhere in the distant future. And so the cycle began again. So, what did it actually mean to survive a medieval winter? It wasn't one single trick. There wasn't a magical medieval method. Survival came from many small things working together. A repaired roof. A stored sack of grain. A bundle of dry wood. A wool garment. A preserved vegetable. A functioning tool. A neighbor willing to help. A family member who knew what to do. A fire carefully maintained. A meal carefully stretched. None of these things sounds extraordinary. Together, they created survival. That may be the most important lesson. History is often described through major events. Wars, kings, political changes, battles. But most human life was not made of those moments. It was made of ordinary days. And ordinary people needed extraordinary patience to keep those days going. Most of the people we have followed through this story left little behind. Their names may never appear in famous books. Their houses may have disappeared. Their clothing is gone. Their conversations were never recorded. Their winter nights were never photographed. But they existed. They raised families. They worked. They cooked. They repaired. They worried. They laughed. They hoped. They watched the seasons change. And they survived enough winters to create another generation. When we look at a medieval village today, it can be tempting to see only old buildings and archaeological remains. But those places were once full of people. Someone stood beside that hearth. Someone carried that bucket. Someone repaired that roof. Someone sat beside a child. Someone looked outside during a snowstorm. Someone wondered whether the food would last. Someone waited for spring. And that person had a life. A real life. With ordinary hopes and ordinary fears. And now, after all those cold nights, the winter is finally behind us. The snow disappears. The roads become visible again. The fields slowly return. The fire is no longer the center of every decision. The family can open the door without immediately feeling the need to close it again. More daylight enters the house. The children spend more time outside. The animals move more freely. The family begins another agricultural season. And perhaps, for a little while, nobody talks about winter. But they remember. They remember how much wood they used. How quickly certain foods disappeared. Which part of the roof needed repair. Which clothing needed replacing. Which tools failed. Which neighbors helped. And which lessons should not be forgotten. Because winter will return. It always does, but next time, the family will be a little more prepared. They will collect more fuel. Preserve more food. Repair things earlier. store what they can, and teach the children what they learned. This is how ordinary people survived. Not through one great secret, but through preparation, adaptation, community, patience, and countless small decisions repeated every day. So if you imagine that medieval household one final time, don't imagine only the cold. Imagine the small fire, the warm bowl, the patched blanket, the quiet conversation, the sleeping children, the old stories, the sound of wind outside, and the knowledge that, despite everything, another morning will come. The winter night may have been long, but it was never permanent. And perhaps that is why the story of ordinary medieval families is worth remembering. They lived without many of the things we consider essential today. They had less. They worked harder. They depended more heavily on nature and on one another. But they also developed an extraordinary ability to adapt to the world around them. And every winter taught them a little more. So tonight, as the story slowly comes to an end, imagine the medieval village once again. The houses are quiet. The fields are dark. The roads are empty. The firelight has faded. And somewhere, inside a small home, a family is sleeping. Tomorrow will bring work. Tomorrow will bring another meal. Tomorrow will bring another sunrise. But tonight, everything is quiet. The wind moves gently across the fields. The last embers glow beneath the ashes. The wooden walls hold back the night. And the family rests. The long winter has passed. Spring has arrived. And the world begins again. Good night, and sleep well.